There's a form. It's not remarkable. There's nothing unusual about it. It's a letter-sized document with faded blue header, a few lines filled in by hand, and at the bottom, a space for a signature. Marcus Reeves signed that form on a Tuesday afternoon. He doesn't remember the exact time. Probably around 3 o'clock. He had signed 17 other forms that day. That one was the 18th. The form said that Kenneth Tillman was ready to return to society. 9 months later, Marcus was on his knees in a grocery store parking lot, looking at a woman he had never seen before in his life and would never see again. Tillman had come back, and the second victim was found 400 meters from Marcus's own front door. But this is not a story about Tillman. You already know stories about Tillman. The world is full of them. This is the story of the 18th form, about the system that produced it, about the man who signed it, and about what happens to that man when he realizes he did everything right, and it still went wrong. Stay with me for 20 minutes, because what you're going to find here isn't about a criminal. It's about how systems make decisions that no single person actually made. Marcus Reeves had 17 years in the field when he signed Tillman's form. 12 of those years were in Indiana's parole system. Before that, 5 years as a social worker in Chicago. He had chosen his career deliberately. He had made the conscious decision to work on the side of the system that was, in theory, the side of reintegration. He wasn't naive. He knew recidivism existed. He had seen cases come back. He had sat across a table from men. He knew would violate their conditions before they even walked out the door. But Tillman was not that kind of case. At least not on paper. Kenneth Tillman had served 6 years for aggravated assault with bodily harm. 6 years. Not 2, not 3, 6. During that time, he had completed 2 rehabilitation programs. He had earned his GED. He had attended anger management. 48 sessions, 100% attendance. He had a sister in Muncie, Indiana, who offered a fixed address and a job at her husband's hardware store. The prison psychologist who evaluated Tillman at release gave him a moderate low-risk score. That was the second most favorable rating on the state's 7-point scale. Marcus read that file 3 times. I look for what I always look for. Employment instability, no support network, prior parole violations, documented substance use. Tillman had none of those markers. On the scale we use, he scored well. Marcus Reeves repeated that sentence in 3 separate interviews over the following years. Not as a justification, as a statement of fact. He did what the protocol required. He followed every step. He checked every box. And the thing about protocols that nobody wants to acknowledge, the thing they don't tell you when you start working in reintegration, is that protocols are not built for individual cases. They're built for patterns, for averages, for what works most of the time. Most of the time is not 100% of the time. And when a protocol fails, there is no field on any form where you write, the system was inadequate for this specific case. That field doesn't exist. What exists is a space for a signature, and below it, an agent identification number. Agent identification number 4471, MR, Marcus Reeves. To understand what happened to Marcus Reeves, you need to understand how a parole decision is actually made in the state of Indiana, not how you imagine it happens. How it actually happens. There is an instrument called the LSIR, Level of Service Inventory Revised. It's a standardized 54-item assessment used in more than 40 U.S. states to measure an individual's risk of reoffending. The LSIR scores 10 categories: criminal history, education, employment, financial situation, family and social environment, accommodation, leisure, companions, alcohol and drugs, emotional and personal orientation, and attitudes. This assessment was developed in the 1980s. It has been validated in population-level studies. It works for predicting patterns in large populations. For a specific individual sitting across from you, it offers probabilities, not certainties. Tillman scored 43 on the LSIR. Indiana's threshold for high risk was 58. He landed 15 points below the cutoff that would have required additional supervision. 15 points. The equivalent of half a dozen different answers. Marcus did not create the LSIR. He did not set the 58-point cutoff. He did not define the categories. He did not decide which answers carry more weight than others. He simply applied the instrument he was given, used the criteria he was handed, and made the decision the numbers suggested. This is called evidence-based decision-making. It is considered best practice in the field. It is what the system asks of its agents. There is a cruel irony in all of this that took me years to be able to articulate. The system was designed to remove human judgment, bias, and unscientific intuition from the process. And it did so efficiently enough that when the process fails, it has also removed any concrete place for accountability to land. Those words were not said by Marcus. They were written by a criminology professor at Indiana University in a paper published 2 years after Tillman's second offense. But Marcus read them, and he said that when he did, he sat holding the paper for 20 minutes without being able to move. Because the thing about systems is that they work exactly as they were designed to work. The problem is not that the system broke. The problem is that the system functioned perfectly. And still, a 32-year-old woman named Diane was hospitalized with 6 broken ribs and a collapsed lung. Diane was the second victim. The first had been years earlier. She was what sent Tillman to prison the first time. The second, Diane, was an employee at the Quick Shop convenience store on Washington Street in Muncie, Indiana. She didn't know Tillman. She had nothing to do with him. She was closing Register 3 when he walked in. Marcus lived on Maple Street. The Quick Shop was on Washington. The distance between the 2 streets is 412 meters in a straight line. He found Diane for reasons that have nothing to do with Marcus Reeves. He walked into that store because it was closest to the apartment he rented after his release. He was buying beer. The violence was what professionals call a low-threshold situational trigger, a technical phrase meaning it was unplanned, unpremeditated, and no more predictable by the LSIR than it had been. Marcus's signature did not bring Tillman to Washington Street. But without Marcus's signature, Tillman would not have been on Washington Street to be brought there. Marcus found out about Tillman's second offense in a way he described as completely ordinary, which somehow made everything worse. He was in a staff meeting on a Monday morning. His supervisor walked in with a folder, said there was a situation, said the names, said Tillman's name, said the status, rearrested, awaiting trial. Marcus heard the name, and at first thought it was a different Tillman. The surname isn't uncommon. Then his supervisor read out the inmate identification number, and Marcus knew. He described what he felt not as guilt, not immediately. The first thing was a strange sense of dissociation, as if the information were about a hypothetical case, a training exercise. Then came the involuntary review. Tillman's file reconstructed in memory, item by item, the LSIR results, the psychologist's report, the sister's letters, the job offer, the perfect attendance record at anger management sessions. And then, not immediately, but that afternoon, when he was in the parking lot of his own grocery store picking up dinner, came something he hadn't expected. It wasn't guilt. I would have understood guilt. Guilt has a logic to it. I made an error, therefore I feel bad. What I felt was different. It was a kind of systems vertigo, like suddenly realizing that the floor beneath your feet isn't solid. It never was, and you just didn't know. Marcus stood in that parking lot long enough that a store security guard came over to ask if he was all right. He said yes, got back in his car, sat there looking at the steering wheel for, he said he doesn't know how long. Could have been 10 minutes, could have been less. Then he drove home and called his supervisor to let her know he might need a few days of medical leave. She asked if something was wrong. He said he wasn't sure how to answer that question. What Marcus Reeves was experiencing has a clinical name: vicarious accountability trauma, a specific variant of secondary trauma identified in justice system professionals who make consequential decisions within bureaucratic structures and are then confronted with the unforeseen consequences of those decisions. It is not the same as professional guilt. It is not the same as burnout. It is specific, it is documented, and according to research published in the Journal of Criminal Justice in 2019, it affects approximately 38% of parole officers over the course of their careers. 38%. That means in any mid-sized parole office, roughly 1 in 3 agents is carrying something for which no part of the institutional structure was ever designed. Because the form has a space for the signature, it doesn't have a space for the aftermath. Here is what the state of Indiana did after Kenneth Tillman's second offense. It opened an internal review of the parole approval process. The review lasted 4 months. It concluded that the protocol had been followed correctly. It recommended updating training materials to emphasize situational risk factors not captured by standardized instruments. That recommendation was incorporated into the department's procedures manual as Addendum 7.3. Addendum 7.3 consists of 2 paragraphs and a 6-item checklist. Question: would those 2 paragraphs and 6 items have changed Marcus Reeves' decision about Kenneth Tillman? Honest answer: nobody knows. And the review report doesn't ask the question. What the internal review did not address. First, caseload ratio. At the time of Tillman's approval, Marcus Reeves was managing 72 active cases. The standard recommended by the Association of Paroling Authorities International is 50 cases per agent. 72 is 44% above the recommended threshold. Second, average time spent per file before decision. An internal analysis conducted 3 years earlier had indicated that agents carrying more than 60 active cases spent an average of 11 minutes per file on routine reviews. Marcus himself estimated he spent between 15 and 20 minutes on Tillman's file, above the average for his unit. Third, the interval between Tillman's last psychological evaluation and the date of the parole decision, 4 months and 17 days, within the validity window under the state's protocol. At the far end of that window, but within it, none of those 3 factors appears in the internal review report as a contributing element. When a system fails, the investigation the system conducts of itself rarely manages to see the parts of itself that contributed to the failure, not necessarily in bad faith, because those doing the investigating live inside the same structure. The fish cannot see the water. Same article, same criminology professor. The passage Marcus reread 4 times. Marcus Reeves remained in the department for 3 more years after Tillman's second offense. During those 3 years, he made dozens of parole decisions, approved some, denied others, recommended additional supervision in cases where the numbers didn't necessarily justify it, but where his experience told him something wasn't right. The department has no formal mechanism for my professional instinct says something is off as a decision category. So Marcus began writing extended notes and files, notes that sat in the system but didn't affect the LSIR score, didn't change the threshold, didn't redefine the protocol. They were notes for the record, notes that said, I saw something here the instrument doesn't capture. In 3 years, he wrote those notes in 22 files. Marcus took early retirement at 52. There was nothing unusual about that. It was an option he had. He had the years of service. He qualified for the benefit. He told his supervisor he wanted more time with his family, that he felt it was time for a change. Both of those things were true. They were not the only reasons, but they were true. The other reason, the one he didn't tell his supervisor, the one that took years to articulate out loud, was something else. He had reached a point where he could no longer open a file without a level of anxiety that, by his own assessment, was incompatible with good decision-making. And if he had learned one thing in 17 years working parole, it was that anxiety in decision-making is the single element most likely to distort judgment. So he left, not dramatically, not with declarations. He simply left. Diane recovered physically from the assault. Tillman's trial resulted in a 16-year sentence with no possibility of early parole. Marcus and Diane have never met. He knows who she is only from what was in the reports. She does not know he exists. That is one of the strangest things about the position Marcus occupied in the story. He is a link between 2 worlds that never directly touched, and neither of those worlds is aware of him. I want you to consider something for a moment. There's a legitimate debate about how much responsibility a parole officer should carry when someone he evaluated goes on to reoffend. There are arguments on every side of that debate. There is research. There is legal philosophy. There is public policy. This video is not here to resolve that debate, but there is a smaller, more concrete question that the larger debate tends to swallow, and one that I think matters independently. What do we do with the people who live inside systems that produce consequences they cannot control, cannot fully predict, and cannot reverse? Marcus Reeves did his job. He did it correctly, within the parameters he was given, and he still carried something for years. The system had no mechanism for that weight, no protocol. No addendum, no form. There's a field on Indiana's parole approval form labeled Additional Agent Observations. It is a free text field. No character limit. You can write whatever you want there. Marcus Reeves said that on Kenneth Tillman's file, he left that field blank, not because he had nothing to say. Because what he had to say was not about Tillman. It was about the system. And he knew that no note in that field was going to change the system. So he signed, and the form moved to the next step in the protocol. Parole systems in the United States supervise approximately 4.3 million people at any given moment. That is more than the entire population of the state of Oregon. To supervise that number, there are roughly 93,000 parole officers across the country. Each of them signs forms. Each of them makes decisions with incomplete information inside structures that were designed for population-level patterns, not for specific individuals. The national recidivism rate in the United States sits at approximately 68% within 3 years of release, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. 68%. For every 100 people released, 68 will be rearrested within 3 years. What that means, what nobody likes to say out loud, is that the system was not designed to prevent individual reoffending. It was designed to manage population-level recidivism rates. Those are different objectives, and the distance between them is a question no form can capture. There's a school of thought that says the answer is better technology, stronger algorithms, more data, more sophisticated predictive models. There's another that says the answer is more human judgment, less reliance on standardized instruments, more discretionary power for individual agents. There's a third that says the problem is neither technology nor judgment. It's caseload ratios, structural underfunding, and the impossible weight placed on individual agents. When asked, Marcus Reeves doesn't align definitively with any of those positions. He says they're probably all partially right. And then he says something that stopped the interviewer mid-note. The problem with the question, what do we fix, is that it assumes there's a prior state we can return to. But maybe there never was one. Maybe this is the system working. And if that's true, then the question we need to ask is different. Not what do we fix, but what do we build instead? I don't have an answer to that question. Marcus Reeves doesn't either, at least not one he considers complete. Addendum 7.3 in the Indiana Department Procedures Manual certainly doesn't. What I know is this. There's a form in a file somewhere, with a faded blue header, with a few lines filled in by hand, and with a signature at the bottom. And there's a man who signed it on a Tuesday afternoon between the 17th and 19th forms of the day. That man woke up the next morning, went to work, opened another folder, and did the best he could with what he had. That's what systems ask of the people who live inside them. The question is what we ask back. If you stayed with us for 20 minutes, thank you, genuinely. If you have something to say about what we covered, the comments are open, not for a verdict on who is right or wrong. To keep thinking together. The next video goes somewhere different. Same idea, the back rooms of systems. Different character. An emergency dispatch recording. Something captured before anyone understood what was happening. Until then,